Goal, attempt, failure, cost, lesson, escalation. This is the try-fail cycle, the almost invisible pulse that keeps a story alive, keeps the audience engaged, and sets up the narrative's thematic payoff. This is present in nearly every story. Try-fail cycles are inherent in most everything we interact with. The games that we play, the skills that we learn, and the stories that we consume. But how do we write this? And why exactly is this so important in storytelling? Welcome back to the Wrestling with Words podcast. My name is Cameron. I'm a writer, an editor, and your host. Here, we talk about all things related to writing and storytelling. And the goal is to help you tell better stories while also understanding how the best stories are told. In fiction, the try-fail cycle works a bit like this. A character has a goal. They attempt to achieve this goal, but fail. Either a full failure or a partial failure. However, when they fail, they face some sort of cost or setback and are given a lesson, and then there is some kind of escalation of the stakes that takes place after. From that point, we start again, though. And largely, the try-fail cycle works like this across an entire story. You might have noticed that this cycle maps pretty well onto the 3-act structure, and that is somewhat by design. The difference, however, is that this cycle, unlike the 3-act structure, can work on a macro level across a whole story, or on a micro level across a chapter or just a scene. A good example to sort of see the repetition in a film is looking at something like Edge of Tomorrow, where in nearly every scene leading up to the main climax, there is a cycle of try and fail. Live, fight, die, repeat. But if we want to see a try-fail cycle for a scene that acts much like an inciting event, we can look at the Alien franchise. The try-fail cycle that usually kicks off every film in the series is that the goal is to inspect or study an organism, or maybe contain a mysterious organism that is encountered or discovered. The organism, though, then infects one of the characters, and the crew tries their best to isolate or quarantine the infected character, but fail to do so. Thus ensues the classic hunt with the xenomorphs. If you want immediate visceral stakes, build a single believable failure that instantly changes the direction of the narrative or elevates what is currently at stake. However, we can also link this across multiple scenes. The best example that always comes to my mind is a failed heist that reshapes the next phase of the plan. The most common and easily imagined is a heist story. You can look at books like Mistborn, the Oceans franchise, or in this case, Lies of Locke Lamora. In Lies of Locke Lamora, Locke and his crew set out to pull off a layered and elegant con. In it, wealth, influence, and control are explicit goals where they stage thefts, misdirections, and plays within plays across the entire city. Those carefully orchestrated plans collapse when betrayal and an unforeseen protagonist picks apart their assumptions, unraveling key moments within this narrative. What started as a clever heist morphs into a city-wide power struggle, with stakes far larger than just money alone. But when we look at narrative story structure, failure and action are the core of seeding a long-term arc. For example, one of my favorite series, the Southern Reach trilogy, that was also adapted into a film, Annihilation, is an excellent example of the try-fail cycle playing a role over an entire trilogy. To begin, the mission where the bulk of the story takes place in the first book, and what kind of is the center focal point of the other two, the all-female mission that is sort of kicked off due to the body that is in charge of Area X, has tried a number of different missions to enter Area X and failed to discover the origins and purpose. But for the purpose of the first novel, the team goes into Area X with the aim of observing, cataloging, and containing an anomalous zone, approaching it like a scientific problem to be solved. Their measured attempts fail as the environment resists comprehension, driving many of the crew mad. The cost is existential. Team members are lost or altered, and the mission's objectivity collapses into personal transformation. The lessons and revelations are a mass of cosmic horror, where the biologist and Control discover that the area rewrites what and who you are, and fundamentally breaks what knowledge means. The escalation is somewhat metaphysical. Survival and identity replace neat scientific goals, and every subsequent attempt risks not just death, but a deep and fundamental loss of self. These examples just touch on the surface of this cycle and its application. However, the fundamental thing that is common is that the try-fail cycle becomes the narrative vehicle, making characters take action and then reflect on the action taken in the context of that failure. It is the cause and effect, action and reaction. But why is that important? So cause and effect, or action and reaction, on the surface, and the simplest way to look at it is that this creates conflict and tension initiated by the character. And after that, we get change. Now, I will say that character change is an important element of Western storytelling, a cornerstone, and doesn't necessarily play as much of a structural role in Eastern storytelling. So a lot of what I'm going to be highlighting is going to be from the perspective of Western storytelling. But what we want to illustrate in our stories is a sense of change, or a direct rejection of change. This will get us set up, at least generally, for those three types of arcs: positive, negative, and neutral. Going into those will be for a different video though. However, trying and failing at something because of a skill level or an aptitude challenge is just one way that we can initiate this change. We can prepare for this try-fail cycle and set up impactful change by giving characters flaws, limitations, and one of my favorites, mismatched skills. In the game Disco Elysium, you play as a detective with a simple goal: solve the murder of the hanged man. But Harry, the detective, is deeply flawed and broken after emerging from a state of amnesia due to a night of doing an ungodly amount of drugs and drinking, or possibly by suffering a catatonic breakdown from a breakup. But either way, his memory is fragmented and his life is in ruins. The character flaws present in Harry greatly enhance the narrative experience and make his highly competent skills points of tragedy. He fails time and time again. Even when rolling a success in a skill check, it is often another setback. His self-destructive nature and addiction escalate the narrative tension, building a stronger sympathetic bond between the player and the character, as he tries and fails and tries again. Though the investigation becomes a much bigger case, where we are not just trying to necessarily solve the murder, but trying to solve the source of what broke Harry and how to fix him, if that is even possible. In terms of limitations, we can look at Jin in Rogue One. Jin's initial goal is to strike a meaningful blow against the Empire and live up to her father's work. But as she approaches it with combat instincts and a lone wolf tactic rather than politics or coalition building, she fails. Those blunt attempts don't win the alliances or the access she needs, and they fail to secure the strategic footholds required for the larger plan. The cost is missed opportunities, eroded trust, and time wasted while the empire tightens its hold. The lessons learning aren't about individual bravado. It's about leadership, planning, and bringing people together, a fundamental message in Star Wars. The escalation, though, in Rogue One turns the mission into a coordinated, sacrificial operation that depends on Jyn learning how to lead and trust a team. And one of my favorite ways to initiate try-fail cycles is by giving a mismatched skill to a character, like in The Witcher. Geralt from The Witcher often finds himself operating outside of his monster hunting skill set, and instead in the company of wizards, kings, and political courts. He often finds himself working outside of that usual scope of work and is ill-equipped and out of place, to say the least. The usual extortion, combat, and blunt negotiations fail against subtle intrigue, laws, and social leverage. The cost is becoming ensnared in something larger than just a single job. New enemies are created, and simple, straightforward jobs turn into messy moral dilemmas that have to be solved by other, less witcherly means. And when we have a flaw or a limitation or a mismatched skill that causes the failure, the character is forced to change in some way, illustrating growth through the conflict in the story. This kind of failure can fall into three useful categories that we can use throughout our story. We have dead ends, kind of a block in progress, redirections, a new path or direction is opened up, and transmutations, a deep fundamental change in a character's identity. Aim to mix these throughout the course of the story, breaking the sometimes common repetitive cycle in the try-fail cycle. However you want to package these things, a character arc, a thematic arc, or some literary message, readers, viewers, and players tend to expect these things. A story often needs a combination of change, reflection, and growth. Failure can change a character's resources, their identity, or the rules of the story. And with these points of failure, these stakes and tension are realized. But from this realization, we have to have some point of reflection too, a point to examine and reflect. And with these points of failure, the stakes and tension are realized. But from this realization, we have a point of reflection as well, a point to examine and reflect on what has happened, what they aren't prepared for, or what they might have lost during that failure. In doing this, we then build to the eventual thematic payoff for when the try-fail cycle is broken and our character succeeds, changes, or has some sort of thematic revelation. But even as effective as this narrative cycle is, there are still some other things to at least be mindful of and to try to avoid. First, there should be a meaningful cost. If we don't have any sense of what is at stake, or we aren't properly invested in the characters overcoming something, the threat of failure or even the failure itself will be unsatisfying and lack a real impact. Second, this cycle can become repetitive if used too often and too frequently. The same objective is failed at, or we have a string of failures after every try. It might be helpful to change the narrative rhythm. We can introduce new information, limits, or handicaps, forcing the character to change their approach. We can also give small victories, interrupting the cycle altogether. Part of the process is to make it so that your narrative direction is not predictable. And third, using failure as a delay tactic is often ill-advised. The failure a character faces should have real consequences. It shouldn't just be used as a speed bump or a stop sign or even a traffic light. Instead, imagine these failures as like a no outlet sign or just dead end. New information should be revealed or the goal should be changed so that the plot can advance despite the setback. I should also add, going off of this traffic example, that if the narrative direction is a road, the failure might be that no outlet sign. The true change the character would have to take to advance the plot isn't just turning their car around, it's getting out of it and proceeding on foot. The change as a result of the character's failure should demand that some major shift happen within them or around them. And just to recap, the cycle generally goes like this: goal, try, attempt, failure, cost, lesson, escalation. And this cycle can repeat itself over the course of a scene, an act, or even a whole narrative. We can use character flaws, limitations, and mismatched skills to facilitate the try-fail cycle, while also initiating the grounds for the character change and growth. And to break up the tone and even the rhythm of the try-fail cycle, we can include different kinds of failure. Dead ends are good to block progression. Redirection can change the direction a narrative is going, and transmutation can trigger that fundamental change in a character or a story's identity. Using a combination of these can break up the sometimes perceived repetition of the try-fail cycle. But I think that is a good place to leave you. Let me know what you think about this narrative cycle and if it is something that you recognize in your own writing. Also, feel free to let me know in the comments if there is another narrative structure that you find useful, or if there is an aspect of the try-fail cycle that you think I missed. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.